I think we've got enough people. It's gone 4 o'clock. So welcome everybody. I'm David Johnson. Just to invite you or welcome you to the 8th talk in our series on resisting the hostile environment, hosted by the Language, Literature and Politics Research Group at the Open University. This is the 4th series our research group has run. We've had ones on keywords, the meaning of freedom, the critical citizen, and as I say, we've got 10 talks in this series. We're up to the 8th one. What we've aimed to do, as you know, is to interrogate the hostile environment initiated by Theresa May in 2012 from a range of different disciplinary perspectives. We've had legal people, historians, creative writers, and today we've got a literary critic, somebody who works in an English department. We're very pleased to welcome Hengame Sarukani from the University of Durham. Before I introduce Hengame, I'll just a couple of housekeeping points. Just a reminder, you've all done this already, to mute your mics, turn off your cameras. And then also just the reminder to type your questions into the chat box both during and after the talk, and then I'll invite you to speak to your question. And finally, a reminder that we'll record the talk and it'll be hosted on our website, not the question and answer session, just the talk. So very briefly, just to introduce Hengame, she's the assistant professor in Black British literature in the Department of English at Durham University. She's taught in the past in British Columbia, University of Leeds, Manchester Metropolitan University, and she's published quite widely in the field of immigrant literature, immigrant legislation, and is most of the way through 3 quite big projects. The first, a monograph on the cosmopolitics of 21st century Black British literature and visual culture, looking at disavowed cosmopolitan thinking within the creative and theoretical history of Black British studies. I'm reading from her website here. The second is on the Empire Windrush in 1948, and that's what she'll be speaking to today, which traces the global history of the ship through new materialist approaches. And she's also at the early stages of a book on immigration law, notions of documentality and experimental global migration literatures. Before I hand over to Hengame, I just wanted to hold up this cover of the magazine Wasafiri. Hengame did a special issue on the Windrush for Wasafiri, summer 2023. Just to recommend it very strongly. It's a fantastic edition. It's got a piece by Gary Young, the ex-Guardian journalist, an interview with Carol Phillips, an interview with Hazel V. Carby, some terrific reviews and some poetry and creative writing. And as I say, that was how I got to know about Hengame's research and why I invited her to the session. So that's strongly recommended if you've got the time to dip into that. So over to you, Hengame. I'll turn my camera off and the screen is yours.
I'm just going to share. Make sure share my screen. Okay, fantastic. Everyone can see it. Just let me know if there's any issues. Okay, thank you so much, David. And thank you to the Open University and the Language, Literature and Politics Research Group for organizing this series and for the invite as well. Thanks to everyone for coming out today. It's a real pleasure to be here. As David was saying, my talk is drawn today from 2 rather large ongoing projects. The first is a book-length venture on the global transnational history of the Empire Windrush, one that engages with new materialist approaches as a methodology, and even, I must admit, as a kind of provocation sometimes. This history is in some ways a theoretical project, but it also draws extensively on many years of archival research on the ship itself. The second project is a co-written book with my colleague Agnes Woolley. This collaborative work investigates the role of undocumentation in contemporary global migration literatures. And by literatures, we mean hybrid texts that often exist between genres, so between testimony, poetry, fiction, the documentary form, and the archives. Today, I'd like to dwell with the insidious nature of documentation as a political act. I'm interested in exploring what new materialist thinking can give us in terms of understanding the grim process of undocumenting people, and the Windrush scandal becomes here a rather agonizing case in point. To do this, I'm going to be looking specifically at Maurizio Ferraris's theory of documentality, while turning to some key archival documents around the arrival of the Empire Windrush. Ferraris is an Italian analytic philosopher and part of a group of thinkers aligned with new materialist theories and new realist philosophies. The so-called newness of such philosophies has been hotly contested, and I think Sara Ahmed, in the context of feminist studies, offers one of the more blistering critiques. But generally speaking, new materialist thinking shifts from an emphasis on epistemology, so the theory of how we know certain things of knowledge, to ontology, the theory of existence itself, of what things are. Central to new materialist thinking is the turn to matter, that there is an underlying innate value to matter itself. There are numerous and conflicting articulations of new materialist ideas. However, there's a sense of a new kind of formalism that separates the physical, i.e. material world, not quite from the human world, but from the specific idea of human exceptionalism. What would it mean, for instance, to take the physical world, so money, stationery, art, oil, garbage, as seriously as the human one, or even, as some critics suggest, on a level plane as the human world? How does our understanding, not so much of knowledge, but of being, change? As Christopher Gamble, Joshua Hannon, and Thomas Nail argue, it's not enough merely to say that everything is matter. For us, there is nothing but matter. Ferraris's focus on ontology expresses itself in what he calls a descriptive metaphysics that understands the social world through documents. Documents are social objects for Ferraris. They are what matter in the world. They constitute our social reality and our very existence. Documentality is an ontology of social objects made up of traces, registrations, and documents, and it manifests itself, Ferraris argues, in those bits of paper that accumulate in our pockets, in the pieces of paper or plastic that we hold on to more carefully than our wallets, and then in the mass registrations that fill up computers, archives, cell phones, and banks. I'm not sure Ferraris would put it this way, but documents, especially if we understand them through modes of registration, inscription, and tracking, constitute the materiality of our humanity, that is, the physical, somatic world of the human body. And here I see documentality as bridging that new materialist separation between objects and things on one side versus the human world. So understood not just as a recent theory of the social world, but a recent global theory of the social world, I think it's rather surprising that there hasn't been more work done on documentality and contemporary practices of migration and border control. Identity documents like the passport are central to conceptualizing the profound significance of documentality in practices of post-imperial statecraft, in mitigating biopolitical life itself. While Ferraris's focus is not on migration, his theorization of documentality does offer a provocation toward taking seriously a relational understanding between human and non-human worlds, and in this case, between migrants and the documents that determine their lives. In what follows, I'd like to turn to the larger history of colonial migration to Britain, in particular, the circumstances surrounding the arrival of the Empire Windrush, in order to trace one version of the social ontology of documentality, or my adapted understanding of it. This is an ontology, a sensibility of being that we can find in the entanglement between the human and the non-human, between skin and paper. I want to start with Hazel Carby's deeply moving autotheoretical book, Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands, a text that poignantly captures the knots and tangles between documents and the human. Fusing the genres of life writing, history, literary criticism, and philosophy, Carby's book weaves together a multi-generational story that interrogates how the superstructure of the British Empire defined the intimate intricacies of her Jamaican and Welsh ancestries. From 19th century Bristol to 18th century Kingston, Atlantic Canada to Wales, metropolitan London to rural Lincolnshire, Carby intertwines the orphan threads of a transatlantic family history constituted by the lost, neglected, and recovered archives of British imperial history. There's a story at the beginning of the book I want to share. It's probably one of the most important moments in Carby's narrative, as it demonstrates the way in which documents can make or break lives. The story is about Carby's Jamaican father, Carl Colin Carby. In 1978, Carl traveled to the Immigration and Nationality Directorate, the IND, in Croydon for an interview that would complete his application for a British passport. Carl was British. He was born in Jamaica, served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, and settled in post-war England with his Welsh wife and 2 children. Like most people, Hazel Carby writes, he had not constantly renewed his British passport because he hadn't traveled outside the country since being demobilized from the RAF in 1950. Despite bringing the necessary paperwork, his RAF records and original passport, the young woman who interviewed Carl accused him of forging his documents. She swept his papers off her desk onto the floor in a wild gesture of incredulity, while verbally lambasting him as, quote, an illegal immigrant who had sneaked into the country, landing at night on the Essex coast with a boatload of other illegals. Though he was not given any official documentation of application denial, the callousness of the Home Office compelled Carl to obtain a Jamaican passport and to renounce his British citizenship. There are 2 specific scenes from the book I want to pause with. The first is Carby's response to this particular moment. This is what she tells us. I have kept all my father's papers. Gathered from the floor of the office in Croydon is his first British passport, issued on 8 April 1943, which declares the national status of Carl Colin Carby to be a British subject by birth and his profession Royal Air Force recruit, alongside the letter of confirmation of service from the Ministry of Defense. I have his 3 Jamaican passports, all of which carry entry visas to the United States, his birth certificate, and handwritten copies of every letter that my father wrote to the Immigration and Nationality Directorate, part of the Home Office, over a period of more than 2 decades. Each letter is formally addressed, Dear Sirs, Madame. Each is stapled and labeled copy. This is the second moment. Here, Carby returns to recount her father's reaction to his interview at the IND in Croydon. When my father described how he had been treated in this interview, I shared his humiliation. As I sat by his side, he held fast to my hand, and its grasp as tight as that of a man who was drowning. He seemed to be forcing air into his lungs through a throat constricted with the effort not to cry, not to scream in frustration. His need to tell his story fought against his distress. He could barely speak. I felt as if I was manipulating mental forceps to extract word by word what had happened. Read in the current context of the ongoing Windrush scandal, where inhumane government policies and administrative inadequacies have resulted in the detention, illegal deportation, and withholding of rights of pension-age British citizens born in the Caribbean, Carby's book lays bare a protracted legacy of bureaucratic cruelty that has distinguished Britain's imperial afterlife. Here, documents literally constitute flesh and the body. Official state-sanctioned documents in the form of passports, birth certificates, correspondence with the Home Office, pieces of paper really, produce the effect of drowning, suffocation, and paralysis. The way in which Carby narrates this moment matters, but in a deeply counterintuitive way. Carby's description of the morbid power of documentality highlights what Ferraris leaves out in his thinking. If documentality offers a theory of culture where social reality is shaped by inscription of some kind, paperwork, if you will, then what happens when that which is inscribed does not reflect reality? What happens when the objects of bureaucracy, the documents that determine civil breadth, documents that even Ferraris admits enact power, are not enough? What happens when these documents no longer correspond to the subjects they represent? What happens when one becomes undocumented, when skin is detached from paper? This is the heart of my argument. I find the notion of documentality useful, particularly as a way of understanding the social reality reflected in our contemporary regimes of border control and migrant oppression. But there are limits to Ferraris's work. The theory of documentality does manage to depoliticize matter. It accounts for the document's power, but not of its failure. Ferraris suggests, quite rightly, I think, that society is not so much based on communication, but rather on registration. Registration, inscription creates social objects, i.e. documents here. There is, however, a naive assumption around the politics of registration. Not just that registration can be oppressive, but that registration can be overturned and subverted. Perversely, and I'm saying perversely because I think we associate registration and documentation with oppressive practices exclusively, only some bodies are granted that connection between skin and paper. Only some bodies are protected by the totality of documentality. Carl Carby's experience in 1978 at the IND offers just one example of the agonizing effects of bureaucratic human power and the ease with which this transition from documented to undocumented can occur. Like many recent victims of the Windrush scandal, Carl's British passport had not been regularly updated. Despite his legal right to live in the country, the speculative, unofficial power of the immigration official in Croydon rendered his status as illegitimate. This was despite the presence of official documents, and recount here Hazel Carby's meticulous accumulation of her father's papers after his death. Everything was stapled, everything was copied. These documents are matter, but they did not actually matter when they should have. Carl was, in a sense, illegalized, not through registration or his documents, but on the whim of a single person that represented an institutionalized structure that was already in the 1970s explicitly hostile to those racialized in terms of the boundaries of the nation. The devastating power of this moment in Hazel Carby's narrative lies in the way in which it openly tracks the prehistory of the Windrush scandal. Imperial Intimacies is very much a book about documents. There are extracts from the archives, from newspaper clippings, advertisements, registers of the enslaved, pasted throughout the entire book. The book illustrates what I want to call here a resistant documentality. Carby's text highlights the limits of Ferraris's notion of documentality by politicizing it. The turn to matter, the turn to documents is crucial, especially when skin and paper no longer correspond. I'd like to turn now to another set of documents from the National Archives in Kew, documents which are part of this much larger archive on the Windrush. These documents demonstrate the political backdrop to the Windrush scandal, and we very much need this longer archival history. Like Carby's Imperial Intimacies, the government memos, telegrams, etc. in these archives redocument the history of bureaucratic violence behind the scandal, while exposing the way in which undocumentation essentially begins. I do want to note first, however, that the hostile environment, in Theresa May's articulation of it, was about the creation of an unthinking bureaucracy whose central aim was to meet deportation targets. The hostile environment is an expression of documentality par excellence. The policy created illicit divisions in the enactment of immigration law, and through that moment we saw the emergence of what became known as the Windrush scandal, where pension-age British citizens, the children of those first-generation Windrush migrants who arrived in the 50s and 60s from the Caribbean, were denied, detained their rights, illegalized, and or deported to countries they hadn't lived in since they were children. They essentially lacked the documentation to prove their right to remain. The scandal was a scandal because it was this particular generation, it was this particular ship and this particular group of once colonial citizen migrants. The imaginary of the Windrush is powerful. It's part of a well-meaning yet intense commemorative culture that has since the 50th anniversary in 1998 cast the ship as a nationalist marker that inaugurated so-called mass migration from the colonies and the ascent of a diverse and multiracial Britain. This salutary imaginary has distorted the history of that moment. The jubilant celebrating of the ship during Danny Boyle's 2012 Olympic opening ceremony is just one case in point. This is not a congratulatory national story. Despite the 21 June 1948 headline in the Evening Standard that read, "Welcome home," the Caribbean migrants aboard, who had every right to be in the country, faced immense hardship and hostility when they arrived. It is not their stories that are in the archives that I'm looking at today. It's not their voices that we can trace in the official documentation housed at the National Archives specifically. Rather, in these official spaces, we can find evidence of the beginnings of the scandal, the way in which government documents, previously sealed, marked as confidential, predict the coming undocumentation of the children of these Windrush migrants. The first document I want to look at with you is a telegram from the then acting Jamaican governor, dated 11 May 1948, and addressed to the Secretary of State for the Colonies. The subject reads as important. These are the words of the acting governor. I regret to inform you that more than 350 troop deck passages by Empire Windrush have been booked by men who hope to find employment in the United Kingdom. And a little later, public announcements of the difficulty of obtaining work have not discouraged these bookings. The discrepancy here in the telegram between government policy and its enactment is stark. In 1948, the British government actively recruited to fill labor shortages, particularly via EVWs, or European Voluntary Workers. This program recruited continental Europeans to fill these labor gaps. While European migrants were actively welcomed, migrants who were, by the way, not British subjects, this telegram shows us how those with rights to legally remain from the colonies were actively discouraged. It is with regret that the acting governor of Jamaica writes of a shipload of incoming workers, many of whom had fought for king and country during the war. I find traces of this informal modality of institutional undocumentation through various files. Though official, they are often unorganized and haphazard, casual almost in their tracing of this early documentation. I found this document, for instance, in one file. It speaks poignantly about these early traces. This is an incomplete document, of which I'm still trying to determine its author. And it says the following about the Windrush before its arrival. This is a spontaneous movement by Jamaicans who have saved up enough money to pay for their own passages to England. And it's the next three sentences that are important. We do not know who were the ringleaders in the enterprise, but I've asked the governor of Jamaica for a report on this point. It was certainly not organized or encouraged by the colonial office of the Jamaica government. On the contrary, every possible step, ... What possible steps have been taken to discourage migration? If that migration is not only official policy in terms of the national need for labor, but also a legal right. In this memo, we see the history of oppressive paperwork, of essentially a hostile archive that is in 1948 seeking to delegitimize, in terms of discouragement, the rights of these colonial migrants. Everything is in those ellipses, the hidden structures of oppression that cannot yet find expression on this particular page, but will indeed find a juridical voice in subsequent immigration policies from the 1960s to the present that will legitimately delegitimize the rights of these Commonwealth migrants. One government employee put it aptly in his response to the Colonial Office who are expressing serious reservations about the incoming ship. And I'm going to read the second last paragraph that you see in front of you on the page. It may become extremely embarrassing politically if at a time of labor shortages there would be nothing but discouragement for British subjects from the West Indies, while we go to great trouble to get foreign workers, i.e. EVWs. I regret to inform you, every possible step extremely embarrassing. These phrases capture the early utterances of the Windrush scandal. These are the troubled, hostile Windrush archives. This is the longer history of the desire to officially undocument this generation and its children. If documents represent a social ontology, then these archives expose the political unconscious of government policies that will later manifest in more disturbing and official ways. The resistant documentality I'm attempting to trace here is not a contrapuntal reading of the archives. It is not in the vein of Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation. The turn to official matter, in this case, not only in the archives, but also via immigration documents, legislative documents, landing cards, and identity cards, does not attempt a strategic imagining of voices and bodies erased from administrative documentation. Resistant documentality takes seriously Ferraris's contention that social objects, inscribed matter, here documents, generate a generative theory of culture and object-oriented ontology. If documents can shape social life, then is it not possible to deploy documentality as a resistant methodological practice to reinvigorate questions of social justice? There are limitations to this approach. Documentality, as articulated by Ferraris, is quite an imperfect theory of our world, one that reads as depoliticized and even abstracted. However, the methodological tactic of resistant documentality ventures to ground itself and dwell with that delicate distinction between the human and the document. Through an attention to the archives and various administrative documents, it attempts to articulate how tracing registration can bring together a much-needed anti-imperial relationship between skin and paper. Thank you.